In the spring of 1943, as the war raged across continents, a secret order came from Washington that would forever change the way America fought in the shadows. The newly formed Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, was tasked with doing what the conventional army could not: infiltrate occupied Europe, sabotage enemy infrastructure, and gather intelligence directly from the heart of the Reich. It was a bold, dangerous experiment in unconventional warfare, and at its center were 5 operatives whose courage would push the limits of human endurance, and whose fates would vanish into history. Captain William Colby, a young intelligence officer from Minnesota, was one of the OSS's rising stars. Before he became a future CIA director, he was simply Bill, trained in sabotage and resistance coordination at the OSS training camps scattered across Virginia's farmland. His mission: to parachute into Nazi-occupied France in early 1944 and prepare the French resistance for D-Day. The assignment was classified as Operation Jedburgh, a joint Allied plan pairing American, British, and Free French officers into small, 3-man teams dropped behind enemy lines. On a moonless night in March 1944, Colby and his 2-man team jumped from a RAF Halifax bomber near Limoges, France. Their parachutes opened silently, floating into a sea of darkness. Waiting below were local members of the Maquis, French guerrilla fighters armed with little more than outdated rifles and unbreakable resolve. Colby's orders were precise: train the Maquis in demolitions, sabotage the German railway system, and relay coded transmissions to London using a portable radio the size of a suitcase. The OSS archives describe his first weeks as a mix of triumph and terror. Colby's unit succeeded in derailing German supply trains and cutting communication lines critical to Wehrmacht operations along the Atlantic coast. But with every explosion, the Gestapo tightened its grip on the region. German patrols flooded the countryside, executing civilians suspected of aiding partisans. To protect his identity, Colby often changed safe houses daily, blending in with farmers and shepherds, hiding his radio in haylofts and beneath church floors. According to a declassified OSS field report, Colby's last confirmed transmission came on April 19, 1944. The message was brief: rail line east of Limoges disrupted, casualties minimal, Germans mobilizing, then silence. For 3 weeks, headquarters received nothing. London feared the worst, that the team had been ambushed or betrayed. In post-war interviews, a few surviving Maquis fighters recalled that German SS units raided a nearby village shortly afterward, dragging away suspected collaborators. No one could say whether Colby had escaped or perished in the chaos. To understand the stakes of his mission, one must grasp the situation in occupied France. Hitler's forces were preparing for an Allied invasion, fortifying the Atlantic Wall and tightening surveillance. Resistance cells were growing bolder, but also increasingly exposed. For every act of sabotage, reprisals followed, entire towns burned, hostages executed. The OSS operated knowing capture meant torture and execution under the infamous Commando Order of 1942, which demanded that all enemy spies be shot without trial. A diary entry from another Jedburgh operative, Lieutenant Paul Hellawell, reveals the atmosphere of fear. "We were shadows among shadows. Every farmhouse could be a trap. Every friend could be a Gestapo informant. Yet we moved, because standing still meant death." These words, written by men who lived and died in secrecy, capture the essence of Colby's mission. Weeks later, an intercepted German report mentioned a saboteur group neutralized near Limoges. No names were given. No bodies were identified. For the OSS, it was another entry on a growing list of missing in action. When Allied forces liberated France months later, Colby's name reappeared. Astonishingly, he had survived. He resurfaced in Brittany, emaciated and exhausted, having spent weeks hiding with resistance fighters. But for every Colby who returned, several others never did. His disappearance, though temporary, became a symbol of the silent war waged by the OSS. Behind enemy lines, time and geography dissolved. Survival depended on instinct and luck. For many operatives, fate was dictated not by strategy, but by chance. A passing patrol, a local betrayal, or a missed signal from London. As Allied headquarters scrambled to rebuild contact with missing field agents, rumors began to surface. Whispers of others who had gone missing without a trace, whose missions remained shrouded in secrecy. Among them was a woman whose code name struck fear into the Gestapo itself. Her limp made her recognizable. Her cunning made her unstoppable. Her name was Virginia Hall, and she was about to vanish into the mountains of France, leaving behind one of the most haunting mysteries of the OSS. By 1944, few names in occupied France carried as much fear or admiration as Virginia Hall. To the Gestapo, she was known as Artemis, a ghost-like figure orchestrating sabotage and escapes across central France. To the OSS, she was their most resourceful operative in Europe, a one-legged spy who defied both her physical limitations and the Nazi regime. Hall's disappearance later that year would become one of the most enduring mysteries of the war. Virginia Hall was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and educated at Barnard and Radcliffe before joining the State Department. But after losing her left leg in a hunting accident, she was barred from serving as a US diplomat. Refusing to accept a quiet life, she joined Britain's Special Operations Executive, the SOE, in 1941, becoming one of its first female agents. By 1943, she had established entire resistance networks in Vichy, France, coordinating sabotage operations, smuggling Allied airmen to safety, and organizing supply drops. Her artificial leg, nicknamed Cuthbert, became legendary among her comrades. When the OSS absorbed many SOE operations in late 1943, Hall was transferred to American command. Her new mission was clear: return to France under a new identity and rebuild resistance networks devastated by Gestapo crackdowns. The operation's codename was Diana. It was to be her most dangerous assignment yet. In March 1944, Hall slipped back into France disguised as a milkmaid, her prosthetic leg concealed beneath layers of coarse wool and mud-stained skirts. Using false papers under the name Marcel Montagne, she traversed back roads by bicycle, traveling from Brittany to central France. With her radio transmitter hidden in milk cans, she coordinated drops of explosives, money, and weapons, each coded signal transmitted from barns and attics that changed nightly to avoid German triangulation. By May, her network, known as Heckler, was fully operational. The Maquis groups she supplied began cutting rail lines, ambushing convoys, and disrupting German communications ahead of the Allied invasion. One of her fellow agents later recalled, "She ran her circuits like a general. The Germans were terrified of her. They called her the most dangerous Allied spy in France." But success brought exposure. By early June 1944, the Gestapo had deciphered fragments of intercepted radio traffic. They knew Artemis had returned, and they were closing in. Orders went out across occupied France: capture the limping woman at any cost. Hall's last confirmed transmission to OSS headquarters came on June 30th, 1944. Pilot secure, preparing exfiltration, movement toward Pyrenees. According to OSS records, she had arranged to guide a downed American pilot through the Pyrenees Mountains into neutral Spain, a perilous route patrolled by German Alpine troops. A courier sent days later failed to find her at the rendezvous point. Her radio frequency went silent. Local witnesses told conflicting stories. Some claimed to have seen a woman with a limp traveling with two men through the foothills near Saint-Girons. Others spoke of German patrols combing the trails at dawn, followed by distant gunfire echoing through the valleys. In one village, an elderly shepherd recalled decades later that a woman, American or English, had been hidden in a mountain hut for several days before vanishing without a trace. After the war, the OSS conducted a series of investigations into her disappearance. But in a twist worthy of a spy thriller, Virginia Hall reappeared months later, alive. She had crossed into Spain after weeks of evasion, weakened but unbroken. From Madrid, she cabled OSS headquarters, safe, awaiting extraction, mission complete. The agency, stunned by her survival, later awarded her the Distinguished Service Cross, the only civilian woman to receive the honor during World War II. Yet even with her survival confirmed, mystery lingers around those lost days in the mountains. Post-war intelligence files mention a missing courier, the unnamed pilot she guided, and a burned-out cabin found along the Pyrenean border. Were these remnants of her journey, or clues to another agent who never made it home? In later years, Hall seldom spoke of her time in France. When asked about her disappearance, she replied only, "It was cold, and there were wolves." Her understatement concealed the unimaginable peril she faced, hunted, crippled, and utterly alone. She would go on to serve in the CIA, her wartime records sealed for decades. Her story became emblematic of the OSS spirit, fearless, silent, and often forgotten. But even as she resurfaced, others did not. For some, the coded messages stopped forever. Their missions continued only in rumor and fragmented reports, one of them involving a Marine officer deep in the Italian Alps, where snow, silence, and steel would conspire to erase an entire team from history. The name of that man was Sergeant Peter Ortiz. In the rugged mountains of northern Italy, where the snow-covered Alps sliced into enemy-held territory, the OSS launched one of its most perilous missions of the war. The man leading it was Sergeant Peter J. Ortiz, a former US Marine turned spy, fluent in French, German, and Italian, whose courage had already earned him the Navy Cross. His orders in early 1944 were straightforward on paper, but nearly suicidal in practice. Infiltrate the Italian Alps, organize local partisans, and disrupt German supply lines feeding the Gothic Line. The mission was codenamed Operation Ripe, a name that would later echo through OSS history as one of its most mysterious disappearances. Ortiz was unlike most operatives. Before joining the OSS, he had fought with the French Foreign Legion in North Africa, escaping German captivity to rejoin Allied forces. His knowledge of European terrain and guerrilla tactics made him an ideal candidate for behind-the-lines operations. By the time he landed in Italy, the OSS had shifted focus from reconnaissance to sabotage, targeting bridges, tunnels, and transport routes vital to German retreats. Ortiz's team, composed of a handful of American and Free French agents, parachuted into the Cuneo region in February 1944. The drop went smoothly, but the landing site was far from ideal. They came down in deep snow, scattered across a mountainside lit faintly by the moon. Partisans from the local resistance, the Giustizia e Libertà movement, met them with sleds and mules, leading them to a hidden valley hut stocked with meager supplies. Ortiz's command post was a small stone barn, cold and isolated, but close enough to the German convoys that rumbled along the valley roads each night. From the beginning, Ortiz understood that survival depended on secrecy. The Gestapo had already infiltrated resistance circles in Turin and Milan, and German mountain troops, the Gebirgsjäger, patrolled every pass. Despite these dangers, his men succeeded in cutting telephone wires and destroying fuel depots, forcing the enemy to divert entire battalions to secure the region. Each act of sabotage carried brutal consequences. For every German killed, villagers were rounded up and executed. Ortiz knew this, and it weighed on him. His personal notes, preserved in OSS files, contained a chilling line. "We are ghosts in their mountains, but ghosts leave footprints." In early March, Ortiz's team received orders to destroy a crucial rail tunnel near Borgo San Dalmazzo, used by the Germans to transport armored units. As they prepared for the attack, a blizzard descended without warning. Temperatures plummeted, visibility vanished, and communication with Allied command was lost. Local partisans urged Ortiz to wait, but the Marine refused. He believed the storm would provide cover from German patrols. They set out at dusk, 9 men trudging through waist-deep snow, each carrying explosives and rations for 2 days. According to post-war accounts, they were last seen near a mountain pass above the village of Paraloup. Sometime that night, distant gunfire echoed through the valley, followed by a single flash of light on the horizon. The next morning, the storm raged on, erasing all trace of the path they had taken. When the weather cleared 2 days later, partisan scouts found nothing but charred wreckage, a half-buried supply sled, shredded parachute silk, and German shell casings. No bodies, no tracks leading away. The OSS listed Ortiz and his entire team as missing in action. German records from the same week make no mention of an engagement in the region, fueling speculation that the group had been ambushed by fascist militias or betrayed by informants. Months later, captured German officers spoke of an American saboteur taken near Cuneo, identified by his fluent German and defiant attitude. The man reportedly refused to give his name. He was last seen being transported toward Verona for interrogation. Whether this prisoner was Ortiz remains uncertain. The description matches, but the records end abruptly there. No remains were ever identified. After the war, villagers in the Piedmont region spoke of strange finds in the mountains. Pieces of US radio equipment, dog tags, even a weathered American-issue pistol found embedded in a rock crevice. But the men themselves had vanished, swallowed by snow and time. The The US Army later confirmed Ortiz had indeed been captured, surviving imprisonment until 1945, but two members of his team, Sergeants John Barton and Anthony Marchese, were never found. Their fate became one of the many unsolved chapters in OSS history. The official narrative reads, "Presumed killed in action, yet without confirmation." Their story remains suspended in the cold, a haunting reminder of how thin the line was between heroism and disappearance. For the OSS, such missions revealed both the power and peril of clandestine warfare. Every operation behind enemy lines carried the same uncertainty, success or silence, and as the Italian front settled into a grinding stalemate, the agency turned its gaze eastward, toward the fractured, partisan-controlled hills of Yugoslavia, where another operative, George Mussolini, would vanish amid chaos, betrayal, and political intrigue that blurred the lines between ally and enemy. The Adriatic would soon claim another OSS mystery. By the autumn of 1944, the Balkans had become one of the most volatile fronts in all of Europe, a patchwork of warring factions, each claiming to fight for freedom, but often turning their weapons on one another. Deep within this chaos, the Office of Strategic Services sent one of its most experienced operatives, George "Gov" Mussolini, a former US Marine captain and a veteran of OSS operations in Eastern Europe. His assignment was to re-establish contact with resistance forces loyal to General Draža Mihailović, leader of the royalist Chetniks, and coordinate airlifts of downed Allied airmen stranded in Yugoslavia. What began as a rescue mission, however, would dissolve into one of the OSS's most politically charged disappearances, and one that remains shrouded in secrecy to this day. Mussolini was no stranger to danger. In 1943, he had already led the successful Operation Halyard, which rescued more than 500 Allied flyers shot down over Yugoslavia. His familiarity with the terrain and local customs made him invaluable to the OSS Balkans desk. Yet by late 1944, Yugoslavia was no longer the same. Communist partisans under Marshal Josip Broz Tito had gained the upper hand, forcing Mihailović's royalist forces into retreat. Washington's support was shifting toward Tito, but the OSS still maintained covert ties with Mihailović's loyalists, fearing that abandoning them would fracture post-war alliances. Operation Ranger, as Mussolini's new mission was called, aimed to gather intelligence on both German troop movements and the shifting political landscape. On the night of October 18, 1944, a US Army Air Force's C-47 transport aircraft departed from Bari, Italy, carrying Mussolini and his small team. Their destination, a remote airstrip in central Bosnia, cut deep into the forested hills near Prijepolje. The plane never arrived. For days, Allied radio operators attempted to raise contact. Nothing. Italian radar logs recorded the aircraft's last known position over the Adriatic Sea before it vanished from the screen. British Coastal Command dispatched reconnaissance flights along the presumed route, but no wreckage was found. It was as if the aircraft, and everyone aboard, had simply dissolved into the mist. OSS files declassified decades later suggest the disappearance was not an accident. One memo from the Balkans desk, dated October 23, 1944, notes: received intelligence from Bari source indicating Tito's forces interfered with planned drop zone. Possible compromise of mission. Another report from the British Special Operations Executive hints that Tito's command viewed Mussolini with suspicion, believing he was still loyal to Mihailović. The political tension between the two resistance factions had escalated into armed skirmishes. For Mussolini, flying into this fractured landscape meant navigating not just enemy lines, but allies who no longer trusted one another. In November, a local peasant claimed to have seen a large aircraft burning in the mountains near the Drina River. OSS recovery teams reached the site weeks later. Scattered debris suggested a crash, but identification was impossible. The wreckage bore no clear markings, and no bodies were found. The war moved on, and so did official attention. The file on Mussolini's mission was quietly marked unresolved. Years later, new information surfaced. A Yugoslav defector who fled to Italy in 1948 told American intelligence officers that a group of foreign airmen had been captured by Tito's partisans shortly after a mysterious crash in late 1944. He claimed they were held briefly in a remote detention camp, interrogated, and later transferred to the Soviets. No corroborating documents have ever been found. If true, It would mean Mussolini and his men didn't die in a crash at all, but vanished into the murky web of post-war politics between East and West. The OSS itself remained silent. In 1946, the agency awarded Mussolini the Legion of Merit for his previous operations, with no mention of his disappearance. When the CIA declassified his wartime record decades later, much of Operation Ranger's file was missing. Entire pages redacted, names blacked out, coordinates erased. Even today, historians struggle to separate fact from rumor. Local villagers in Bosnia still tell stories of a ghost plane, an aircraft seen flying low over the mountains in a storm, followed by a flash of light and silence. Some claim partisan units scavenged parts of the wreck for years after, using the aluminum to repair farm tools. No human remains were ever uncovered. The Adriatic, cold and vast, keeps its secrets well. The disappearance of George Mussolini stands as more than a wartime mystery. It reflects the shadow war fought not just against the Axis, but within the Allied ranks themselves. A conflict of ideology, allegiance, and secrecy that foreshadowed the Cold War to come. His name joined the OSS's growing roll of operatives lost without trace, their missions buried under layers of conflicting reports and classified archives. But as 1945 approached, with the Third Reich crumbling and victory in sight, those files began to tell a pattern, one that troubled Allied command. Too many agents missing, too many unanswered questions. When the OSS compiled its final wartime casualty list, 5 names stood apart: Colby, Hall, Ortiz, Mussolini, and a 5th, known only by his codename, Lancer, whose final operation in the dying days of the war would vanish into the fog of history. And it is with Lancer's mission that the OSS's most haunting disappearance story would reach its end. By the closing months of 1944, the European war was entering its final chaotic phase. The German front was collapsing under relentless Allied pressure, but victory came at a cost: confusion, fragmentation, and the rise of new enemies concealed within the fog of peace. Amid this shifting landscape, the OSS prepared one of its last covert operations on the continent. It was a mission designed to bridge the war's end and the uncertain dawn of what would become the Cold War. The man chosen to lead it was known only by his codename, Lancer. Official records reveal little about Lancer's true identity. Some declassified OSS memoranda suggest he was an officer from the 101st Airborne, temporarily seconded to the OSS's Special Operations Branch. Others claim he was a civilian linguist with Balkan experience. What is certain is that in early February 1945, Lancer was assigned to a deep infiltration mission into Austria's southern borderlands, a region still fiercely defended by retreating Wehrmacht units and infested with Nazi counterintelligence operatives desperate to cover their tracks. The operation's purpose was both military and political. Lancer's team was to locate hidden Nazi supply caches rumored to contain not just weapons, but looted Allied intelligence and gold. More importantly, they were to make contact with anti-Nazi Austrian resistance cells in preparation for the Allied advance. The mission was coordinated with elements of the British SOE under the working name Operation Veil. Its success required secrecy, speed, and the ability to navigate a landscape torn apart by both retreating German troops and advancing Soviet forces. On the night of February 9, 1945, a small twin-engine Lockheed Hudson departed from Bari, Italy, carrying Lancer and 3 others, 2 OSS radiomen and a British liaison officer. They were equipped with silenced Sten guns, explosives, and radio sets designed for shortwave transmission to OSS base Algiers. The plane's destination was a clandestine landing zone in the Styrian Alps, near the town of Moreau. It never made it. The Hudson's last radio call, intercepted at 0:43 hours, reported engine trouble. Then mighty static. Somewhere between the Adriatic coast and the Austrian border, the aircraft vanished. No distress beacon, no recovery. When the snow melted months later, local shepherds discovered fragments of fuselage high on a ridge near Schladming, but no sign of the crew. OSS investigators sent after the war noted that the wreckage appeared oddly stripped, the radio compartment empty, the serial plates removed, and the cockpit instruments gone. It was as if someone had been there before them. One account, preserved in British SOE archives, adds a disturbing layer. A captured German officer from the 5th SS Alpine Division claimed that his unit intercepted an American infiltration party near Moreau around the same time. According to his statement, the group carried false identification papers and coded notebooks. They were captured after a brief firefight and transported to a local command post. When Allied forces reached the area weeks later, the post was abandoned, its records burned, its cells empty. Theories proliferated in the aftermath. Some OSS veterans later argued that Lancer and his team had been executed by the SS to prevent intelligence leaks. Others suggested a more complex betrayal, that Soviet operatives, already sweeping through eastern Austria, intercepted the OSS group and seized their materials, viewing them as Western spies encroaching on post-war Soviet zones. One fragmentary CIA memorandum from 1951 mentions an unconfirmed sighting of a captured American officer held in Soviet custody near Bratislava, matching Lancer's description. No verification ever followed. To this day, Austrian mountaineers still find remnants of the Hudson's wreck, a fragment of US Army parachute silk here, a rusted .45 casing there, small artifacts swallowed by decades of snow and thaw. Local lore calls the mountain Geistgrat, the Ridge of Ghosts. Some say the villagers buried the men quietly after finding their bodies frozen in the wreckage, fearful of retribution from the SS. Others believe they survived the crash, only to vanish into the borderlands, another set of names lost to shifting front lines and Cold War boundaries. Operation Veil was officially closed on June 1, 1945, marked no further action. Its files, like so many OSS operations at the twilight of the war, were boxed, classified, and forgotten. Yet the mystery of Lancer, whoever he truly was, became emblematic of the OSS's uncertain legacy. In victory, the Allies had won the visible war. But beneath the surface, another conflict was already beginning, one of silence, disappearance, and control over secrets too powerful to be revealed. When the OSS was dissolved later that year, replaced by the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, its records listed 82 operatives missing, presumed dead. 5 stood out, not because of rank or fame, but because their missions touched the edges of the unknown. They had vanished behind enemy lines, leaving no trace but coded transmissions, fragments of wreckage, and unanswered questions. And as historians combed through the archives decades later, another revelation emerged, a final OSS ledger, marked for eyes only, listing those operatives who never returned. The last entry bore no name, only a single line typed in fading ink. 5 most daring agents, presumed lost. The war had ended, but for the OSS, the search for answers had only begun. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe in May 1945, much of the world celebrated liberation, peace, and the collapse of Nazi tyranny. Yet in the shadows, another silence lingered, one born not of victory, but of absence. For the families and comrades of OSS operatives lost behind enemy lines, the end of the war did not bring closure. Instead, it deepened the mystery. The Office of Strategic Services, once the beating heart of America's wartime espionage, now faced its most sobering reckoning, the accounting of those who had never come home. The war had pushed the OSS far beyond the traditional boundaries of military intelligence. From France to the Balkans, Italy to Austria, its agents had fought an invisible war, building resistance networks, sabotaging enemy supply routes, and preparing occupied nations for liberation. But with that invisibility came a terrible price: anonymity in death. Official reports listed them as missing in action, their missions redacted under layers of classification that would remain sealed for decades. In the bureaucratic quiet of post-war Washington, they became file numbers, footnotes in a conflict that had consumed millions. By late 1945, an internal document titled Missing OSS Personnel, European Theatre began circulating through the agency's corridors. It listed 5 names of particular concern: Captain William Colby, recovered after months of uncertainty; Virginia Hall, miraculously alive; Sergeant Peter Ortiz, rescued but scarred; George Mussolini, missing with no trace; and the mysterious Lancer, presumed dead. Each had operated independently, yet their missions formed an eerie pattern: deep insertion, limited communication, disappearance, and silence. What linked them all was a shared doctrine: secrecy above all. OSS Director William Wild Bill Donovan had instilled it from the start. You can't be brave if you've never been afraid. His operatives were trained to vanish if necessary, to destroy every trace of their presence rather than risk capture. But in the months after victory, Donovan's successors faced an unsettling truth. The OSS's own success at secrecy had made its ghosts impossible to find. Declassified field notes from the European desk reveal the tone of frustration. One memo reads, "We taught them to disappear. Now we cannot bring them back." Across the Atlantic, Allied intelligence officers combed through intercepted German and Soviet archives, hoping for clues. They found fragments, a radio message from the Alps, a downed plane's serial number, a partisan's recollection of a foreign soldier hiding in the hills, but nothing conclusive. The war's debris had swallowed the evidence. Even as the OSS dissolved in October 1945, its final duty became preservation. Thousands of coded reports, maps, and field notebooks were boxed and stored in the National Archives. Among them lay the personal effects of the lost: Colby's compass, Hall's broken transmitter, Ortiz's Legionnaire insignia, Mussolin's flight gloves. Each item was tagged with a date and a single phrase: "Mission incomplete." When the Central Intelligence Agency rose from the OSS's ashes in 1947, it inherited both the secrets and the ghosts. Many early CIA officers were OSS veterans, haunted by comrades who had vanished without explanation. The agency's culture, its obsession with deniability, compartmentalization, and silent sacrifice, was born not in the Cold War, but in the mountains and villages of wartime Europe. The lessons of loss had hardened into doctrine. In the decades that followed, researchers, historians, and family members tried to reconstruct what had happened. Fragments of truth emerged through declassification, recovered flight manifests, coded transmissions decoded long after their relevance had faded. Each discovery added texture, but also deepened the mystery. Had Mussolin's plane really been downed, or was he taken by Soviet partisans? Did Lanza's wreckage hide clues to a larger cover-up involving post-war intelligence transfers? Was Ortiz's missing team ever accounted for? Or were they victims of an early Cold War exchange gone wrong? The answers remain elusive. What endures instead is a legacy of courage unmarked by certainty. These were not men and women chasing glory. They were soldiers of the unseen, waging war in places history barely remembers. Their sacrifice shaped the foundations of modern intelligence and forever blurred the line between heroism and disappearance. In 1992, a memorial was quietly erected on the grounds of the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Etched in stone are the names of intelligence officers killed in the line of duty, and stars for those whose identities remain classified. Among those unmarked stars, historians believe, lie the 5 from the OSS: Colby, Hall, Ortiz, Mussolin, and Lanza. 5 stars for 5 shadows lost to history. As the camera pans across their names, the narrator's voice might fade to a whisper. In war, some victories are never recorded, and some heroes never return. But their silence endures, not as absence, but as testament. They walked behind enemy lines so the world could walk free. And with that final note, the story of the 5 most daring OSS spies, lost, found, and forever missing, closes not with certainty, but with reverence. The war ended. The search did not.